And I'm going to invite our colleague at the Irish Hospice Foundation, Catherine Tierney. Catherine is a psychotherapist, and she's worked with a range of different people through the years, and also specialises in grief, and she's done some specific training on complicated grief in the US. But her main role at Irish Hospice Foundation is supporting and being the clinical coordinator for the bereavement support line. And Catherine is going to talk to you just about some of what we understand about grief. So I'll pass over to you, Catherine.
Excellent. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. Thanks everybody for being here. It's just a lovely evening to be part of. So I am going to be covering a few topics around coping with loss and grief, especially at this time of the year. I really hope the slides are useful. There's a lot of material, so don't worry, just absorb whatever you can, whatever makes sense to you. I'm sure we'll be sending out the slides after, so there's a lot of material, but just absorb what you can. So we'll be looking at contemporary models of grief. We'll be looking at hidden losses. We'll be looking at how to look after yourself, because that's so important if you've been bereaved, and especially if you've been bereaved around this time. Okay, I need to move all the people there. So the important thing is to say is that for all grief and loss, it's normal to experience very intense emotions. You could be distraught, distressed, sad, angry. It's all terribly normal. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, and sometimes people get confused about that. They sort of they think based on some of the writings of Kubler-Ross that there's a certain linear pathway through, and basically there aren't stages. Grief isn't linear. It's more a marathon than a sprint, and it's more a roller coaster experience. So just to reinforce that there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and everybody's journey through grief is unique and individual. Just to say a bit about Kubler-Ross, she did so much work around bereavement, but her study was with patients who were terminally ill. And so the research that she published and that she wrote about was very much around that research and that study. So that's why things like bargaining came into it, and that whole sense of stages. So just to reinforce that there's no stages, there's no 5 stages or 7 stages, that grief is very unique. There's no right or wrong way. It's not linear, and it's really more a roller coaster rather than anything else. Grief is exhausting. This poor fella in the middle, but it really is. There's so much going on. And there's not even just the emotional side of things, but we'll come to that in a minute. There's so much else going on in terms of cognitively, spiritually, even in terms of behaviorally. So it's just an emotional journey and an exhausting journey. So just to really be mindful of that, and to mind yourself. One of the things that is talked about these days is the idea of dosing yourself. So you can't grieve all of the time, because you just would drown in it. So it's terribly normal, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to dose yourself, to sort of have some time where you're experiencing the grief and maybe being very sad or unhappy, and other times when you really have to adapt to this new life without your loved one. And that's perfectly normal, that idea of dosing, stepping in and out of grief. This is a really great slide. You'll see all the different areas, the physical, psychological, behavioral, spiritual, social, and cognitive. And I suppose one of the things to say is that if you think about one example, which is the loss of a key attachment figure. So if you think about somebody who's lost their spouse or their partner of many years, or their father or their mother that they were very dependent on, it can trigger, especially in people who are insecurely attached, it can trigger a plethora of emotional responses and behavioral responses, from anxiety, separation anxiety, panic, a sort of reluctance to go out, isolation, withdrawal, even a loss of confidence and a loss of emotional regulation. So it's an interesting thing that attachment is somewhere central to this grief that we experience, especially with the loss of a significant other. You look at the last box there in blue, spirituality. Some people have a real crisis of faith, because for some they have a belief system that says that if they're good and they're good people and they're faithful, that bad things won't happen. And so for some there can be a real crisis of faith when there's a bereavement, especially a sudden one or an unexpected one. So just from your own experiences, you might look at all those boxes and really relate to a lot of what is there, or even for, let's say, your loved ones, a parent who's been bereaved. This is a great image that I've borrowed from, with permission, from Anne Dodd. But this coat hanger, we all have them in the wardrobe. But if you think about this coat hanger as a sort of a metaphor, so let's say you have one significant loss and it's a parent years ago, and there's no way you could have dealt with it at the time for whatever reason. So that's one loss that hangs on the hanger. And then years pass and then another parent dies. And again, for whatever reason, maybe you have young kids, you just couldn't deal with it at all. And that other loss hangs on the hanger, and it's another unprocessed loss. And then another loss happens. And just at a certain tipping point, the coat hanger buckles. So this idea of multiple losses, if they're unprocessed and you haven't been able to deal with other losses, then a new loss might just be the tipping point and the hanger buckles, and you just need support to reach for support. What I like about this is the hanger isn't broken and it can be mended. So just remember that if you have a loss and you just wonder why you're reacting so hugely to this loss that you didn't expect to be as significant an impact, it may be because there's unprocessed other losses that really need to be dealt with. And some days it is all just too much when you're bereaved. People grieve in different ways. If you think about in Ireland, culturally, we sort of expect that people are intuitive grievers. We sort of expect that people will, talk about and express their feelings, and they'll cry at funerals and all the rest. So just to be aware that there are also instrumental grievers who really channel their grief into doing. They're more action oriented, so they might channel their grief into a campaign. They might channel their grief into a project or setting up a charity. I remember one case where there was a man whose son died in a road traffic accident, and as part of the accident a wall was knocked down, and the father went out. That's how he channeled his grief. He rebuilt the wall, and a lot of neighbors came and said, look, why are you doing this? We can do it for you. And he just, this is how he was dealing with his grief. So it's very good to know, what kind of a griever am I? Am I an intuitive or an instrumental, or a bit of a blend of both? But sometimes you have couples where there's let's say one partner who's an intuitive griever and is really critical of the other partner who isn't grieving in the same way. So it's very good to understand this for yourself, for your loved ones, or for your clients if you work with clients, that there's different ways that people express their grief. I'll fly through a couple of contemporary models just because they're very useful, and you may have come across them before. But William Worden came up with this idea through his research and his writings on the 4 tasks of mourning. And again, these make sense. Task 1 is to accept the reality of the loss. Task 2 is to allow yourself the space and time to process your grief and pain. And that's usually with others. You think about the pyramid, that might be talking to friends and family, or if you need more support, talking to counsellors. But so accepting the loss, processing the loss, and trying to adjust to a world and a life without your loved one in it, which is a huge adjustment and a huge process. And then number 4 is this idea of continuing bonds, that naturally we find a way to keep the connection with our loved one in death as in life. And that might be So for example, if your mother has passed away, you might wear her ring, you might have some of her jewelry. I know I have some of my mum's stuff in the kitchen because she was big into baking and cooking. Someone might have the gardening tools of their dad, or an old sweater or a hat. So continuing bonds is very, very normal, and that's task 2. And just to say that there are some things that complicate these tasks and complicate the process of grieving. And those factors that Warden identified were things like who the person is who died. So if you can imagine a child who dies, it's very, very difficult to accept that. So that's the who. The attachment piece is number 2. So that's the attachment pattern. And again, for people who are insecurely attached, it's very hard for them to let go of this significant other that they might have been quite dependent on. So that there can be a real struggle with that. The how can be an issue. So for example, if it was a tragic accident or something that really shouldn't have happened, then that can be a real struggle for the mourner to accept the reality. The past losses is significant. So if other people have, if you have past losses that have never been dealt with, then that can make this transition through these tasks more difficult. Or if you're the type of person that hasn't coped well in the past with other losses or other difficulties, or you're very pessimistic in your worldview, then that can make this all quite difficult. If you've got a lot of supports, these tasks are easier. If you've got less supports, and that's the reality for many people, if they're isolated and they don't have support, this can be a real struggle. And number 7 is if you have other stresses and other losses at the same time as a bereavement. So for example, if you've lost your house, or you're moving house, or you're just about to give birth. I know one lady who went into hospital to give birth, and her mother, who was her rock, died at the same time, and she never really navigated this in terms of processing the loss of her mom because of all of that. Tonkin was a grief counsellor, Lois Tonkin, and she did a lot of work and still does a lot of work with clients who are bereaved. And one of the things that she learned from her clients is that they really taught her that grief doesn't shrink, it doesn't go away, but they grow and expand their life around the grief. And it's just a lovely diagram that I've borrowed from Cruise, the UK organisation, bereavement organisation. So the grief doesn't disappear, it doesn't go away, but you grow and expand and adjust your life around it over time. Some of you may have heard of the dual process model, and this again is a natural inbuilt way that we process our way through loss. We spend some time in the loss, and then we spend some time dealing with our new life and adjusting to our new life. You might have someone who now has to get all the kids out, get the kids to school, do that on their own as a parent because the other parent has died. So this idea of you spend some time in restoration oriented, actually just having to get on with life, and then you have some time where you allow yourself the space and time to grieve. But this oscillation and this movement between both is natural and an inbuilt process within us. And sorry, one thing to say before I move on is sometimes what happens is people get stuck on the left-hand side and they get stuck in the loss, and they just can't function. They can't move on. They can't deal with the loss at all. They sort of are drowning in this side of things. And they're the people who need support. They need their doctor and they need professional support. By the same token, somebody who flips into really, really busy, working all the time, doesn't deal with the loss, doesn't talk about it, doesn't allow themselves to feel, they're getting stuck in this side of things, and that'll complicate the grieving process for them. So both sides of things, if you get stuck, you'll complicate the grieving process, and you'll need support around that. Continuing bonds, this is a lovely little image, but just as I mentioned, you know, the bond with the deceased person continues in life as in death, and death as in life. And as I say, that may be you inherit the gardening tools, you inherit the car, you wear the sweater, you wear some of the jewelry, or you chat to the person. I know a man who wrote letters in the beginning to his wife, and from time to time still does, just to keep in touch, or maybe light a candle, or visits the place that was very important to their loved one, and it's a continuing bond with their loved one. Nightmare did a lot of work around sense making and meaning making. So, when you have a significant loss, how do you make sense of it, and how do you make meaning? How do you make life meaningful from then on? And there are several factors that can help. And one of them is that sense of at least the person isn't suffering anymore, and they're not in pain anymore, they're at peace. You might have a belief system that is, we'll all meet again, we'll all be reunited. And that can be really helpful in making sense and you finding meaning. You might throw yourself into setting up a charity or campaigning or fundraising for, let's say, cancer support because your loved one died of cancer. And that can really help you to find new meaning within and around this loss. What can hinder the sense making and the meaning making are things like when it's a tragic death, when it's a sudden death, when it's a death of a child. If you can imagine a road traffic accident where maybe several members of the same family have died. So it's terribly difficult to navigate how to make sense of and how to find meaning when there are tragedies and tragic events around that. You think about COVID, there are many people who died in COVID who died alone and who suffered alone. And that's terribly difficult for the people who are left behind to know that their loved ones died alone or suffered alone and they weren't able to help them. So this can be a real struggle. And again, reach out for support if you can identify with this. And that might mean counseling support or therapeutic support, but it's a difficult one. So what about hidden losses? Orla mentioned something about this. If you think about carers, and for some people, they're caring for so long, but anticipatory grief, the loss around that, is another type of loss. If you think about rehab, and I know Embrace are on the line, so farm accidents, there are many people in the rehabilitation centre in Dunleary. If you've ever been up there, it's a very humbling experience. But for them, they all have to process the loss around this life-changing event. They don't have the same body, they don't have the same life. Their life is forever changed, and their life going forward, and their relationships are changed because there may be now dependency on their family at home for the rest of their days. So there's lots of challenges around the loss and coming to terms with a terminal diagnosis, life-changing accident or a life-changing illness. Even people who are facing retirement and really are struggling to come to terms with that because they've identified so strongly with their profession and their work, and maybe they didn't have a balance in the rest of their life around that. For some people as well who have long COVID, that's been a huge loss. So some of these people are really fearful about, will I ever be able to work properly again? Will I be able to have the energy to play with my kids? So there's huge losses and anxiety around many of these things. If you think about disenfranchised loss, some of the losses are disenfranchised. So for example, pet loss isn't always recognized as a loss. We get some calls to the bereavement support line that are for people who are devastated by the loss of their pet. And it's not always, doesn't always get the recognition from friends and family for the loss that it is. Sometimes people where there's a death by suicide, it can be a disenfranchised loss. Or I know recently someone called the line whose ex had died and she had separated from him. And there was a sense from people that she had no right to grieve because she had separated from this person, but she was grieving the life, the good times that she had, and the life that they shared before the decision to separate. Dr. Pauline Boss, she coined this term, ambiguous loss, and simply put, it's the loss of leaving without goodbye and goodbye without leaving. So if you think about it as somebody may be physically gone, but they're psychologically here. So if someone is a missing person and maybe a body has never been found, so it's assumed that they're dead, but the body has never been found. There's no burial, there's no ritual, there's none of those rites. Or if someone has drowned and again, there's no body has been found. So physically gone, but psychologically here. And the challenges of that in terms of grieving this ambiguous loss. Or you can have someone who's physically here but psychologically absent. And if you think about somebody who's living with a partner who has an acquired brain injury, I know I worked with a lady whose husband had an acquired brain injury, and it was so, so sad because her husband was a completely different man, was volatile, had angry outbursts. He was just it's like a stranger to her. So that loss of living with someone who's physically there but psychologically absent, and that can be living with someone with addiction or living with someone with dementia or Alzheimer's. Can grief get stuck? And I guess we all know that grief can get stuck. Sometimes, again, I mentioned this about, insecure attachment styles. Sometimes it's a person who just cannot accept that this person is gone from their life, that cannot accept that this person that they might have been quite reliant on or dependent on is gone. And they just refuse to update their, if you like, internal working model to allow that reality to sink in. Sometimes it's because the circumstances were so tragic that they just can't get their heads around it. They can't process that reality. Sometimes people just avoid the reality of the death. So they avoid the places that remind them of the person. They avoid talking about the person who's died. They avoid thinking about the person who has died. So these are some of the factors that can complicate the grieving process. In the centerpiece here, I know of some people who also have a sort of distorted belief system that grieving less would mean that they love the person less. And sometimes that can cause real stress and conflict in a family where one sibling never processes grief, but keeps grieving and grieving and grieving, and feels that the other siblings must have loved let's say the parent less if they're managing to process their grief and get on with their lives. So these unhelpful belief system, grief is my main tie to my loved one, grieving less would mean that I love them less. The only thing that will help me now, or that can ever help me, is if that person can come back to life. So these are some of the, I guess, in inverted commas, dysfunctional belief systems that can really complicate the grieving process. In terms of grief at Christmas, I guess I'd encourage anybody who's grieving at this time of year to call the bereavement support line. It's just a tremendous service. It's free, which is wonderful. It's Monday to Friday, 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock, and it's just staffed by really beautiful people. So I'd really encourage anybody, or if you've loved ones who are grieving, or if you've clients who are grieving, to phone the line. It's a super resource. But around Christmas, a couple of things. One is that we have a Grief at Christmas leaflet that's available from the link there, or you can ring the office and ask for them to be sent out. And as Orla said, just to echo that, be really patient and kind with yourself if you are struggling with a bereavement. If you're worried about Christmas and all the rituals and everything, plan ahead, talk to family and young loved ones, keep it simple. If you think there's going to be difficult times, then make a little plan around how to manage yourself and the family around that. Reach for help if you need it. Look for support. Number 5 there says allow yourself happy moments, but I'd also say allow yourself sad moments, because that's so normal. Christmas is such an emotional time, and it's such a ritual time, all the family traditions. So you're going to be sad, but there may be happy moments. Maybe there's a new baby in the family or a new grandchild. So just to give yourself permission that both are possible. For all bereavement, make sure you get exercise and fresh air. Don't isolate yourself. It's never good, but make sure that you surround yourself with people who love you and understand you, and will listen if you need to talk. And this is a great little image. So just the sense of, if you look at, all of these different areas, try to eat well, watch your sleep, try to get some fresh air, keep your friends and family close, physical exercise. So as you process through grief, these are all the areas that are maybe worth a look at to see which of these nourish me, which support me, which help me. What might you need to do more of? What might you need to do less of? And I'd say one thing around work, which is don't rush back to work too soon, because many people do that and they just find that it just pushes the grief along, and then they have to deal with the grief later on. Give yourself permission to say yes to things, but also give yourself permission to say no if there's just too many people inviting you to social things that you just don't feel able for. And I love this thing from Anne Lamott, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few times, including you. So do allow some time for no time, just, for you to be alone, or for you to be quiet, or to go for a walk, and just don't be too busy all the time. This is a great book by Paula Darcy, When People Grieve. It's for anybody who is looking for some reading material, but also there's books on our online library if you want to order some of the books from the shop that we have online. There's a link there. And this is my final slide, you'll be glad to know. So again, the Bereavement Support Line, a fantastic resource. Our website, www.bereave.ie, is a shortcut to it, and it's a super resource. Grieving is a process. It takes time, and it takes as much time as it does. For each person is different. There's no right or wrong way. Everybody's grief is unique. Do reach out and seek support, and don't find yourself isolated. Routine is really useful. So maybe get up and get out, get washed, have a walk, put some structure on your day. It really does help. Grief is exhausting. I say that all the time. So really mind yourself and look after yourself. That's it. Thank you so much for your attention. Right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I hope that some of that would have reassured people, and that sometimes you might be able to recognize some of your own responses. And maybe we can help normalize them by providing that sort of information. So thank you, Catherine. And we're moving on now to look at children. And it's often an area that people can feel very paralyzed about. How do you talk to children about grief and loss? So I'm going to introduce you to Maura Keating. And Maura is the National Coordinator for the Irish Childhood Bereavement Network, which TUSLA and ourselves at Irish Hospice Foundation support and host. So Maura has worked with children and in policy positions in terms of trying to make sure that their lot is better for most of her life, and has now turned her attention to bereavement. So thank you, Maura.
Thanks, Orla. As Orla said, I look after the Irish Childhood Bereavement Network, and I know that most of you probably have tuned into tonight's webinar to look for support and guidance around your own grief. But we wanted to take maybe about 10 minutes just to share some information about children's experience of grief. Because for every loss, there's usually children or young people connected to that loss. They might be your grandchildren, they might be your nieces and nephews, they might be children that you work with, children in your classroom, or they might be your own children. We know that when we're living with our own grief as adults, that it's very hard to get up the energy every day just to function sometimes. Like, there are days when you feel like you just want to stay under the covers. But the reality is, when someone we love dies, your job as a parent or a grandparent still goes on. And we regularly get contacted by parents worrying about how their children might be coping. So based on the type of questions that we get asked all the time from parents, I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit about this type of support we might offer. I'm just going to talk, I'm not going to use slides, but I have all the information I'm going to talk about available for afterwards, and it'll be shared in the email afterwards that'll come out with the slides that Catherine used. And so, if I'm covering a lot of information, don't worry, you'll get it in the backup format afterwards. So a common question we get asked all the time is, what is the difference with children and how they grieve, and how do we know what's normal? So I suppose it's important for you to understand that children process grief and show grief based on a number of different things, to be honest with you. Sometimes it's very much linked to their age and their developmental understanding or their developmental stage. So, you know, that means that very young children will need a lot more explanation. They won't really understand that death is final. They won't really understand the full extent and the concept of death. And they'll need that explained in more detail. And sometimes that can expand right into primary school years. And obviously children who might have additional needs or special needs, or who are neurodiverse, might need that explained in a different way, in a more literal way. The other thing that often impacts on how a child will grieve is the type of relationship that they had with the person that has died, and how their life might change, how their day-to-day life might change when that person is absent. So if it was the grandparent who cared for them after school every day, that's going to have a huge impact on them, compared to somebody who maybe doesn't see their grandparent only at Christmas time. You know what I mean? So the relationship will have a difference. And the other thing that is going to impact the way a child will grieve is the type of coping mechanisms within your family unit. Whether there's a lot of other stresses and pressures, that is going to have an impact on how a child might process their grief. We know as adults, grief can be very overwhelming, and children will feel that too. They just deal with it a little bit differently. They don't tend to wade through that river of grief that we do. They tend to dip in and out of it. So it often appears as if sometimes they're not even affected by the death, because they bounce back into that play mode quite quickly. Really, that's their way of protecting themselves. It's like the pain is too hard for them to deal with all the time. They don't understand it. So they have this inbuilt radar to just, you know, be distracted from their grief. And they use play as an outlet for the grief. So a bit like what Catherine was saying earlier about bouncing from feeling the grief to being distracted by the grief. Children are very, you know, they bounce into being distracted very quickly and very easily and very naturally. But they can't hide from it all the time. And that's why you'll get a lot of outbursts intermittently. And often they're at night time when all the distractions of the day are over. And most children will express their grief through their behavior, mainly because very often they don't have the words to express or talk about or explain the mix of emotions that they're feeling. So expect some physical and emotional reactions. So, you know, low energy, poor sleep, unexplained aches and pains, kind of similar to what we often feel as adults. These are all normal for children when they're grieving. So a lot of patience and a lot of reassurance is needed. They might also express it just through nonverbal things. And, you know, each child is going to be different. Some will be very angry and have angry outbursts. Others might want to isolate themselves or just even hide their feelings, because it's easier to pretend they're not there than to feel the pain. They may worry also that another loved one, if this person has died, then somebody else close to them can die, and that might require a lot of reassurance that they will be taken care of. You're likely to see some regression, and that for older children, that might be just they just can't concentrate in school. They can't hack it. For younger children, it might be regression, like, you know, in their development, they go to bedwetting or go back to thumb sucking, that sort of thing. And for younger children who really don't understand that death is final, you'll see some searching behavior. So they'll be asking, when is mommy coming back, or when is granddad coming back, you know? Because like many children, and most of our children live in a little bubble of safety. We keep them in that bubble of safety. But now when somebody they love has died, that kind of shakes their sense of safety, because they know that bad things can happen to people that they love. Another question we get all the time is like, what words do we use? How do you explain this to children? So we know that death is not an easy concept for young children to grasp. And actually, for very young children, their brain isn't even developed enough for them to understand it. But even older children struggle with it because they live in little fantasy worlds sometimes. And they will struggle with understanding and taking it in. So it involves a lot of explaining and a lot of repetition. So talking, explaining will really help them process things. It's never going to be a once-off conversation when you're talking to children about these sad things and these big concepts and these big feelings. So really be prepared to repeat things, to help it really sink in and to help ease their worries, because the anxiety and worries tend to come from the unknown. So the more you explain and the more you talk to them, you're going to ease their worries and help them. They do need it explained in a very clear and simple and concrete way. And that means using real words like dead and died. And I know that sounds harsh, but often people feel, using euphemisms can be softer for children. But for especially for young children, euphemisms can really confuse them. So like if we say dad's in a better place now, little children will just think, well, why did he go to that better place? And why can't we all go to that better place? So, saying things like, Granddad passed away, we lost Granddad. Children just think, well, let's go and find him, So their mind thinks very literally. So being very concrete is actually not harsh to them. It's easier for them to understand than the euphemisms. But I think the best thing to do is meet them where they're at. Your own child, the children in your family and how they handle their own emotions. So allow them the time to process things in their own way, but let them know it's okay to share how they're feeling and that there is no right or wrong way to feel, because these feelings and emotions are brand new to them. As adults, we've experienced usually a number of losses. For children, it's often their first time. Another thing that we often get parents worrying about is how to answer questions and whether they've answered the questions correctly that children ask, because children will ask questions. Maybe not straight away, but they will ask questions. And especially, they can catch you off guard. And if you've been asking a question that you haven't been prepared for, just be reassured that, as I said, talking to them is not going to be a once-off conversation. So you can always backtrack on the conversation. If you have a bad day or you're worried that you didn't give the answer or you're not happy with the answer you gave, it's okay to have the conversation you want with them another time. Just say to them that you didn't have the chance to explain it properly, that you were in the car or you're in the supermarket or there were too many other people around or whatever, because that's when they'll ask the questions. And just say that, you're ready to have that chat now and go over the conversation with them. Check in with them what they understand, and that will help you know how to pitch your answer. Get a sense of what's going on in their mind, what their concerns and worries are. And a good rule of thumb usually is if they're asking the question, they're usually ready for the answer. But probably the thing we get asked most from parents that contact us is, how do I know whether my child needs professional help with their grief? And I suppose it's important for you to know that the majority of children and young people learn to cope with their grief from within their family and their community. They don't usually need external help or professional help unless there's particular concerns, trauma, or stress. When you understand what's normal for their age and stage, then just give them some time to process what's happened. Time to learn how to adjust to the changes that might have to come about. But if over time you feel that they're really not adjusting or they're not fully getting back to themselves or fully engaging in the usual way that they would, then maybe talking to somebody might help. And you can always check in with us if you want to, if you want to get a sense of whether they need some help. We're always available. But the family is really key to help children understand and deal with the wave of emotions that they are having now and often very unfamiliar to them. So we can't emphasize enough the importance of talking openly and how much that really helps. The way we speak to children becomes their inner voice. Talking openly about death, I know, is easier said than done, especially with children, because as adults, we're kind of in that instinctive mode to want to protect them from the pain of grief. Sometimes we're afraid in case we're going to upset them. Sometimes we worry that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes we're afraid it's going to be actually too hard for us and we're going to get upset in front of them. We often hear parents say to us that they hide their sadness when they're in front of their children because they don't want to upset them. But it really is okay to show emotion. We know that it's a normal reaction to the sadness we're feeling after a death. So hiding the emotions is actually sending a little confused message in a way. You're your child's role model when it comes to grief. They're going to watch and learn from you. So explain to them, you know, that we're going to have bad days and we're going to have good days. But as a family, we're there to support each other through. One thing that I would say to watch out for is when a child might step into the role where they feel that they have to mind you. Now, there's nothing wrong with them showing some empathy, and those occasional gestures where they make you a cup of tea or they give you a hug is always good. But just be mindful that they're not taking on too much. You know, they're still only children and we're the adults. So sometimes if you feel they're taking on too much, just let them know that you're looking after yourself and that you actually have other adults to get some support from. You have somebody that you have your pal that you go for a walk with, or you have, you know, somebody else that helps you out in different ways, or maybe you have some professional support if you need it, so that they know that it's not their job, that they can be supportive and caring, but not have to mind you, because your job is to mind them. But to mind them, you need to get some support for yourself as well. And as I said, we're available. You can contact us through the Irish Childhood Bereavement Network. At the end of tonight's session, Amanda's going to share slides for all the organisations, and you'll see the information will be emailed to you for all the organisations. You can contact any of the organisations. And support is available. One parent said to us just very recently that it's great to get some practical advice about things that can be done and given in normal circumstances. And she said, in normal circumstances, we might instinctively know how to do this. But when you've had a traumatic experience, you just haven't your normal levels of capacity or your sense of composure. So reach out for support if you need it. And I'm going to finish with a very short little video that summarizes some of the key messages about supporting children when they're grieving.
Children grieve too, so what can you do? Acknowledge the tears. Talk. Tell me the truth. Have open, honest conversations using clear language. Explain. Explain things in a way that I understand, no matter how young I am. Acknowledge. Acknowledge my feelings. Encourage me to ask questions. Help me understand and cope with my emotions. Reassure. Reassure me and be prepared to repeat things until I can fully get my head around it. Support. Support yourself. You can't mind me if you don't mind yourself. Talk, explain, acknowledge, reassure, support.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maura. And again, such wisdom. We grieve in families, and families are made up of people at all stages of life, and we need to be there for each other. So thank you for that, and for the lovely video and the reminder to look after ourselves. We're going to invite Amanda Roberts to come and have a short chat with you just about the different services that are out there that can support you. Amanda works with us here in the Irish Hospice Foundation in bereavement development and has a background in health and social care as well as bereavement, having worked for the past 25 years in that area, despite the way she looks, which is very young. Amanda is a great colleague, and I think some of the information here should help you, and that's our hope. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks a million, Orla. I hope I'm off mute there, am I? I am. I suppose normally when we have events like this, the services are just a real integral part of our living with loss events. And normally when you attend these events in person, you walk into the room and the services are all around the room and you can pop up and have a chat with them. And you get a real sense that those supports and services are out there and you're not alone if you're struggling. So my next couple of slides is a way of kind of bringing all these services into the room with you tonight. And I suppose in my day-to-day work, I have the privilege of working with many of these organizations that I'm going to introduce you to. And I suppose I won't go into detail about all of them tonight, but what we will do is we have a very detailed slideshow at the end of tonight, and we'll show it as the event is closing, but we'll also email it out to you in the next couple of days, so you have that information to hand. So the first thing is, what is bereavement care? And what do we mean when we say bereavement care? And I suppose we all have needs after the death of someone close, like Maura and Catherine have spoken about. And a lot of this support is provided by the people around us. So it's our family, our friends, our work colleagues, and our neighbours. And this support can be anything from acknowledgement. So acknowledging that this death has happened. Information, such as practical information as in how to register a death, or information about how grief can affect us. It could be practical support we get from our friends and family, such as someone to do the grocery shopping, you know, in the early days, and you just don't want to face people, and you just want someone to do some of the practical stuff that you're just not able to face at the moment. Or maybe it's emotional support we get from people around us, such as meeting someone for a cuppa and a chat, or going to doing something with a friend just to escape from it all for a bit. Some of us will need additional support. Some of us may feel isolated from or not access to a natural support network around us. Or we may find going through the details of our loss with someone outside our family and friends, just want to talk to someone that doesn't know us sometimes. Or we might seek to share experience with other people who have experienced a similar loss to us. The services that tend to provide this sort of support will be the peer support groups or meeting with a volunteer that has some training around bereavement. Some of us may experience more complex losses or complex needs, and the needs could be complex for loads of different reasons. There may be other things on in your life that makes this experience of loss just really overwhelming. It could be a family conflict, or maybe the circumstances around this particular loss. It might be a traumatic death, or something circumstance around the loss that just makes that person just need that little bit more of extra support around it. And people tend to, in this space, kind of benefit from more of the counselling support services. And how you can access these types of supports in Ireland. Some services are specific to bereavement, and some of them offer support to a particular group of bereaved. So, for example, the group could be around how the person died. So it could be a support service for those who experienced a bereavement through cancer or chronic illness, a bereavement through suicide or farm accident, or homicide or road traffic collision. Or some of the services are grouped around your relationship to the person. So it could be a service around pregnancy loss, or after the death of a child, a partner, a spouse, or a sibling. And we do know there are gaps in service provision in Ireland for groups of people who are bereaved. We also have other support services that are not bereavement specific, but they do offer us information. So, for example, citizen information, we have a lot of information around the practicalities around registering a death or social welfare benefits. And then we also, with regards to counselling, some counselling would have bereavement specific training. So when you're accessing counselling, you can ask people if they have that sort of training to support you if it's bereavement you're going to counsel for. So the first group of services I'm going to introduce you tonight is the support for people who experience pregnancy loss or when a baby dies in and around the time of birth. And the services that we have here tonight are Little Lifetime, Fanagans and the Miscarriage Association of Ireland. And this type of support that a lot of these three organisations, they offer you a varied type of support. So some would offer information, whether it's through their website or leaflets. Some would have remembrance services, support groups, a phone line, or free counselling. And we have Tony here tonight from Fanagans, and he actually runs a bereaved dads football team. So the bereaved dads come together to play football as opposed to sitting in a room and talking. The next group of service I'm going to introduce tonight is the bereaved parents. And you met Sharon earlier on in the candle lighting ceremony, and she's part of Anam Cara. And Anam Cara provides support to bereaved parents after the death of a child, and includes adult children as well. And they offer information support groups and information meetings. And we also have Andrew here from First Light, and they also provide support to bereaved parents, but after a sudden death of a child under 18. And then we also have Rosabelle Rooms, and they more offer the financial support for after a child's died. So if you have to take time off work, you can apply to that fund to get some financial support or some funds for counselling. The next grouping here I wanted to introduce you to tonight is around if people are bereaved through cancer or a life-limiting illness. So we have Tracy you met earlier from Purple House, or also Neve from St. Francis Hospice. So if your relative or friend died under the care of the hospice, you can actually go back to the hospice if you wish and access some of the supports that they have there. The next group I wanted to introduce you tonight is the organisations that support people bereaved through suicide. So we have Bernie here from Pieta, and she's one of the suicide bereavement liaison officers in Dublin, actually. And this is the liaison services. This is to provide a service immediately following a death by suicide. And Pieta also offer a counselling support, and that will be more kind of a little bit later after the death. We also met Fiona here earlier from Hug, and they offer peer support groups around the country for those bereaved through suicide. And they actually offer them online and in person. And that's one of the things a lot of the services are starting to do now as well. Some of them are in person, and some of them are online, and some of them have both. We also had Mary from Terrace and Kayla. Again, they provide support for people bereaved through suicide. Another grouping as well of bereavement organisations are for those who are bereaved through accident or sudden death. So you met Colleen earlier from ADVIC, or sorry, Norma from Bryce Farm, and they're from a farm accident support network. Also Donna from the Irish Road Victims Association, and then Elaine from Cry Ireland, who support bereaved families who are bereaved through sudden cardiac death. One of the final groupings here is just those, and that's one of the questions we got actually in our queue. People had submitted questions around, is there support there for people who are bereaved through homicide? And two particular organisations we have in Ireland are ADVIC and Support After Homicide. And those organisations provide information. They also provide support in and around, the legal and the court process, and some information around what happens there. So that they also provides that sort of information and that kind of support process as well. We also have organisations for particular for widows, and they also provide an online forum, and also they have quite good information on their online forum as well around different aspects of grief, particularly from a widow's perspective. And Bethany is just one of the actually probably one of the few organisations that offer support for anyone who's bereaved from an adult, whether the type of death or the type of relationship you have to the person. And then just, I suppose, just to give you an indication of the bereavement support line. So this is an information line. It's a national bereavement support line, and you can ring for free, and they're up between 10 to 1 Monday to Friday. And it just gives people a confidential space to kind of talk with someone that isn't their family and friend. And I asked the phone line manager, would they mind me popping up a picture of the volunteers, and they met for the first time actually in person on Friday. So it's just to give you a sense of who actually is on the other end of that phone when you do phone. And then just to give you, I suppose these aren't particularly bereavement specific supports, but particularly the text about and the Samaritans, they are support services by phone that can be accessed 24 hours, 7 days a week, just for people that need that kind of support straight away or just really, really struggling. And as we said kind of earlier on, not everyone needs counselling after a bereavement. There's loads of other support services in that space, from bereavement support groups to volunteers who provide that kind of one-to-one listening support. But for the people that do need counselling or would like to link into a counsellor, there are a number of organisations out there. Some of them offer free if you're a medical card holder. Some are low cost and some would be fee paying. But what we will do in the slides at the end of this show or at the end of this evening is to show you some links where you can find a little bit more information about supports like that. And I suppose just to finally to say, look, if you are struggling just to echo what Catherine was saying, reach out to people around you, tell them what you need. Don't assume that they know what you need. And if you would like some additional support outside of friends and family, and you see an organisation tonight that you think might be helpful, look on their website or pick up a phone and give them a call. Or maybe you don't know what you need. Maybe call the National Support Line to talk through and find out, well, what do I need? Or, to have a chat with someone or chat to your GP. Again, we will send a slideshow to people after tonight. And there might be something that you might choose to avail of now. You might think about taking up maybe later on down the road. Or do you know what? It might be something, you might see something here tonight that you could refer someone to or signpost someone to do that you find are struggling in your life, whether it's your friends or family, and let them know about these services. And I suppose the last couple of minutes, we hoped that I suppose you get a sense of the last couple of slides of what is out there and where you can get information for if you'd like to find out a little bit more information about them. And I suppose if you're struggling, do reach out, whether it's a friend or family or a service. And I suppose let people know that first step can be the hardest, whether it is reaching out to a family or friend or a service. So thanks very much, Orla.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And it is so important to find out about all of that support because it's something we don't need or look for until we're actually in the situation. And as so many of you here this evening are. So thank you for that. I'm delighted now to introduce to you Anne Tanham, poet. And I'm particularly delighted that Anne took up our invitation to read some of her poetry today. And Anne has published 3 books of poetry, and I think that's some achievement. And your most recent one, as you know, but not the rest of us, was last year, and it's entitled 26 Letters of a New Alphabet. And obviously themes of loss and grief appear through your work, Anne, and thank you for agreeing just to select some poetry and to share it with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Orla, and it's a real privilege to be here. I'm going to read some poems that I suppose celebrate and honour the death of both of my parents. Mum's anniversary was yesterday. She died 9 years ago, and Mum had leukemia, and Dad died on the 20th of November 3 years ago, and he had dementia. So the poems I've chosen are, I suppose, in some way, are part of that journey through grief. And the first 2 or 3, in fact, are before my parents died, trying to come to terms with the loss that begins when we realise that somebody's going to die. I know that if somebody has had a sudden death, they don't have that chance, but for those of us that did. So because Mum had leukemia, she had to get blood transfusions all the time. So this first poem is called Staunch, and I give blood, and it'll make sense, so staunch. I've sat in the donor's clinic 29 times in almost as many years. Left arm outstretched, needle inserted into the vein while I looked the other way. 29 units of blood, O positive, same type as you. 10 units you've needed since Christmas, and it's still only January. I do the maths in my head. I won't be able to keep you alive. And the next poem, and it's all, there's that moment where, it's self-explanatory. It's called "All Fall Down," but that moment when I suppose when something symbolises the fact that somebody's going to die. So, my mother, before she died, she said, "I've been clearing out," you said, handing me a bag full of pocket-sized tissues. 20 or more packets of tissues, some unopened, most with 1 or 2 missing in action. I took them home along with the gloves and scarves you knew you wouldn't need again. And we took to using them like the stash would last forever, down the end of school bags and swimming bags, jacket and coat pockets. We took to using them like they could be replaced when the last one went missing. And when my dad died of dementia, he was in the nursing home for 4 years. Like for many people, in the end, it's a real struggle to witness somebody getting lost to dementia. So this poem, I suppose, it represents that. Speaking only in tongues to us now, each day he finds new ways to tell us he's leaving. I'd secretly wished for this, that it might be his last winter. But when the nurse called to say the snow is falling faster now, gathering in folds across his bed, I asked if she could conjure up a few more days of summer, afraid there'd be no time to build a shelter from the cold, terrified of what might get lost in the cracks between this season and the next. And then this poem is when somebody does die, and this one is about my mother. It's called Me and Bobby McGee. When the others left, I stayed behind, sat weeping by your side, a child again entreating you to stay, until your stillness entered me, and slipping my hand under your body to where your warmth still lingered, I sat with you a short time longer, while outside the door, life without you waited to begin. A friend called round to pay her respects, asked me, when you took your last breath, did I feel your soul or spirit or whatever we call it leave your body? And where did I think you are now? I said, when you took your last breath, I felt you dissipate. Now you are nowhere. Now you are everywhere. The crib you made still sitting on the TV stand, 3 wise men looking towards the sky, searching for a star to guide them. Joseph, with his arm around his pregnant wife, a puzzled look on his knitted brow. And a few days after, I turned the dial to Sunshine 101, Chris Christopherson singing Me and Bobby McGee, words and music filling the car until there wasn't any room left to breathe. It took another week before you turned up in my dreams. I think we spoke to one another, but neither of us knew what to say before the dream moved on without you. And that first year, the world spun on. Same rotation from west to east, same speed, same seasons in the same order. Tides did their usual thing, waves made their lapping sounds, seagulls screeched their indignation. Over in number 80, small changes were noted. No back and forth of a conversation, 60 years in the making. Elsewhere, the faint sound of uilleann pipes, slide guitars, pianos playing traditional laments, and Louis Armstrong having to remind us, it's a wonderful world. And I'll finish on a poem that it was later in the grief process, and we're probably into that restoration part of it, and when I wrote this poem, it's called Rise. And thank you so very much for listening. There we let go of all the things we lost in the fire. You are still breathing. I am still breathing. The lighthouse still stands at the far end of our south wall. And just today on the canal, 20 swans or more took sudden flight, their wings low and heavy, gathering speed over startled waters. Passers-by stopped in their tracks and for one moment forgot they could not fly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for transporting us into your life and into a part of my own, I have to say. So that is the power of poetry. So I really appreciate that. And I know you're staying with us, Anne, to join the panel. So I'm going to ask people on the panel to turn on their cameras, and I'll introduce the people that you haven't yet met, because you have met Maura Keating and you have met Catherine Tierney. You have met, you saw Niamh Finucane lighting a candle. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Niamh Finucane. And Niamh is the coordinator for the social work service and the bereavement service at St. Francis Hospice in Raheny. So obviously she has years of experience of working with and talking with people who have faced death and bereavement. So thank you for joining us, Niamh. And you haven't met Stephen. Hello, Stephen. I'm pleased to introduce you to Stephen Teep. And Stephen's wife, Irene, died in 2017 from cervical cancer. He's the dad of two lovely boys, Oscar and Noah. And you'll know him as an advocate, and a very effective advocate, Stephen. Today, as Stephen has done for us before on different events, he's going to share his experience of being a grieving husband and a grieving father. And also, Stephen, I didn't get a chance to say to you condolences on the loss of your friend as well, because I think the loss of a friend is a very, very, very particular grief as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
As I said, we tried to pull together some of the questions that we received when people registered. So I'm going to just go through them as best I can and as quickly as we can, given the time we have left. And I might start with you, Niamh, because some people were wondering, you know, they were maybe concerned about themselves. So when should a person consider counselling?
Okay, I think what we need to think about, you know, as Catherine would have spoken about earlier, is that everybody needs some extra information about maybe what's normal in grief and what to expect. And I think coming to nights like tonight, maybe listening to podcasts or reading can really help us to understand that, as well as maybe talking to other people. But if, you know, things are very, very acute and don't seem to be getting any better, or if over time, you know, things are hanging around and there doesn't seem to be any movement, that might be a time to think about getting some additional support, and whether or not it's going to a local group in your area or contacting looking for counselling. But one of the main things we look for is how persistent something is, because grief is a normal response, but it doesn't feel very normal. And oftentimes the strong waves of emotion and our thoughts and our behaviours can be a bit all over the place for weeks and months, and that be a really normal response. So I think it's that continuum of support in terms of information, companioning people, you know, in terms of who's around to help you, right up to getting more professional support. And similarly, because grief is a physical type of stress, you know, sometimes we can begin to have physical symptoms of our grief. And again, while that's very normal, if they're hanging around or beginning to become concerned in any way, to also get those checked out with their GP, to make sure that we're not missing anything either. So I think they're all things to think about when it comes to looking at getting support.
Okay, good. Thank you, Niamh. And maybe this relates, I'm not so sure, but there was a particular line of questioning around maybe fearing grief and not wanting to get over the grief because you'd lose the person again. Does that chime with your experience?
Yeah, I think, you know, sometimes people try and shy away from their grief, because if they don't look at their grief, then maybe this hasn't really happened, and they can stay not quite believing it in some ways. And other times then people can become consumed with their grief. And really what we're looking for, it's that thing that Catherine showed earlier of the dipping in and dipping out of grief. There isn't any way to do grief other than to go through it. And so that means that there are times where we have to experience those difficult thoughts and feelings, and that we aren't ourselves for a while. But we're trying to do it in bite-sized chunks and dip in and out. if we don't do that, you know, in some ways, we don't learn to live with our grief and we don't integrate it. And really what we're looking for is finding ways to live in the world with our grief. And if we can live with our grief, then we can begin to grow around it and reconnect with the person differently. So be able to look at how do they influence their life and how do I keep their connection and their memory very much part of who I am and what I do now. How we look at their values influencing how we live and how we do things. But if we don't in some ways go through some of our grief and feel that pain and begin in some ways to process it and move around it, then that blocks us from actually re-accessing the person. And sometimes people think, you know, oh my goodness, I didn't think of them for an hour or for a few hours and feel very guilty. But actually, you didn't think of this person 24 hours a day when they were alive. And yet their sense of love and care and connection was integrated and part of you. So it's similar in grief. The fact that you don't think of them 24 hours a day isn't you letting go of grief or forgetting, but it's like the grief is moving a little bit into the background so that you can live your life more in the foreground. And there's times where that will shift and change. So it's really important that we look at the idea of integrating our grief, of growing around our grief, of moving along with it, rather than ideas of closure or whatnot. And I think that's what people feel. I think people also fear that they'll be judged either by themselves or by others around them if they're beginning to do things. So how can they go out and do that? Their mother just died. Or how can they, you know, be doing these things now? Do they not realize, oh, that's going on? And really we have to let go some of that and know that our grief is with us each and every moment, despite the fact that for a period we might be doing okay. And sometimes it might look like we're doing okay and our outside and our inside might be quite different. And it takes a while for us to practice and to get those two reconnected similarly together. So I think, you know, grief is something we fear from lots of angles, but it is a normal process, and it is something that we do have to deal with over time. And it's like a journey; it will shift and change.
Oh, that's very reassuring and nicely put. Thank you, Niamh. Given that we haven't heard your voice, Stephen, yet, I might ask you the next question, which is really around, you know, what role other people have in supporting you. So like through your time, have there been questions or comments that people have made that have been unhelpful and maybe ones that have been helpful?
Like, I suppose, you know, the easiest thing, the nicest thing you hear from people is just when they ask, how are you doing? And I find, you know, 5.5 years on after losing my wife, but actually much sooner than that, I suppose, maybe 3 years on, people stop asking and they don't ask anymore. Like, you know, you've gotten over it. And the people who ask me today are the ones who are actually grieving themselves, so they understand exactly what it is. So, for example, a lot of my close friends wouldn't be grieving themselves and for anyone right now. So they kind of stopped asking me how I'm doing. And you can't exactly sit them down and go, this grief that I have, it's a lifelong thing. It's not like a cold I'm going to get over in the next week or two. And I think that's probably kind of a lack of understanding. And it's just like, how are you doing? Because even 5.5 years on, you still get those moments of, you know, that what I always refer to, that tsunami of emotions that just hit you out of the blue when you don't expect it. And you know, you kind of, I think all time does with that is you kind of recover quicker before it knock you down and you'll be catching your breath for about a half an hour afterwards. But these days you catch your breath a little quicker. It still knocks you down though. So what I try and do while managing why I liked that question, I suppose, because it teaches me as well to make sure I keep asking my kids, how are they doing? Only because if they don't have, kind of just listening to Maura earlier, you know, if they don't have, you know, if they have a reaction or say something, but if they don't, it doesn't mean that they're not dealing with it. They might be protecting themselves. So I just kind of like to ask and check in. What's the worst thing? I tried thinking about what's the worst thing. Like, the worst thing is when people just talk about the weather. And that's the worst thing. When you're ignored or what you're going through is ignored. So I didn't really have an answer for that one. But what's positive, it's okay to ask how you're going on. And I think the first couple of times I answered that question, I found it difficult. But it gets easier the more times you answer it. And it's a question that is a good question that people should be asking more of, I think, for anybody that's going through grief, in my opinion.
And persist and remember. Yeah.
I think it's a remember as well, you know.
Yeah.
There's a bit of that.
Thank you, Steve. And from your experience, were there things that were helpful and unhelpful?
Well, I think the kind of the open question is really helpful. You know, for example, you know, for somebody to ask at any, you know, is there anything that I can do to support you? So that, because people need, you know, we need support in different ways at different times. So what I found very helpful was if people really allowed me to grieve in the way that I needed to grieve, but were very clear that they were there to support me when in whatever way that they could. So I found that very helpful. What I was actually thinking about this. I do remember having a moment where I chose not to put up on Facebook or on social media that either of my parents died. For me, that wasn't something that I wanted to share in such a wide space. But somebody had found out, and they put on my wall, you know, a big, you know, so sorry for the loss of your parent, and a big kind of flowery, you know, she'll always be with you. And even though it came from a very good place, in my grief, I had quite a strong response to it, which was I felt that they had invaded my privacy and hadn't respected how I was choosing to grieve in a more private way. And of course, afterwards, I could recognize that it came from a very good place. So I think for me, there was always that sense of being both close enough to ask that question, how are you doing? And what is it that, can I help in any way? But giving people the space also to grieve in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, and to take the steer from the person themselves. In this case, you
Exactly.
just wanted to be consulted. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you, Anne. And given that time is ticking around, and given that we're on the 8th of December, one of the themes that came up in the questions was also around Christmas. And again, I might just put it firstly, if I could pair you, Stephen and Maura, because I think, you know, particularly families where there are children, there can be extra challenges. Have you anything, I suppose, to share with people around Christmas and coping with Christmas, and then in particular with supporting children?
Will I go, or Anne, do you want to answer?
Yeah, you go ahead, Steve.
I think the first thing is Christmas or any milestones, birthdays, wedding anniversaries, even their own anniversary. It took me a while to figure this out, but just don't put yourself under pressure to actually do something. There's 64 days in the year. So don't kill yourself for just one of them, because Christmas Day is just one day, and you're going to be grieving that person for the other 364. So don't kill yourself. But at the same time, remembering them for sure, talking about them. It's okay to miss them. In this house, it's a little more difficult because Irene's birthday is the 23rd of December. So we have, I suppose, those two big moments at the same time. But we don't do anything special, like from, I know, a memorial point of view or anything like that. But we allow the memory of Irene and the person in the room and talk about them. So we do that, but we don't put I suppose I certainly don't put myself under pressure to try and do something for it to include everybody. I just try and do it for the boys and I. And it's just, you know, having that conversation, including the person in the day. And it's quite simple, really, but it is effective. And again, I think this is so important, I find, whether right or wrong, but it's just, I suppose, triggering the conversation and allowing us to have the conversation, particularly with a 9 and a 7-year-old. So I kind of use the day as a good excuse to have a good old chat about memories of Christmas before. So we're talking about it, creating memories for them as well. So the best bit of advice I give is just don't put yourself under pressure. Actually do something later, I think.
Keep control. Thanks,
Yeah.
Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, with very young children, you may be faced with, you know, the fantasy thinking that, you know, if I'm really good and if I ask Santi, maybe, you know, they can bring them back and stuff like that. And that's really heart-wrenching for parents to know they have to deal with that. And that's why all those conversations, those continued conversations, and trying to get inside their head to see what their little fantasies are making up, and trying to help unravel that in plenty of time is really helpful. And even when, you know, like not in those sort of, you know, sit down, we're going to have a deep, meaningful talk kind of conversations, those just little chats, those constant little chats when you're out for a walk or you're going in the car or you're sitting playing Lego or drawing, they're really, really important in the lead up to Christmas. And also for all children, but probably more for the older ones, letting them know it's okay to have fun, have a good day. They can celebrate and enjoy their presents. They can have the fun and still, you know, as Stephen said, include the memories of the loved one that's not there, you know, because sometimes children feel guilty that they're having fun, particularly the older ones, you know. So yeah, but it is just one day, and not beating yourself up and building yourself up into so much pressure. Getting out for a walk, all that sort of stuff that Catherine was talking about earlier as well, you know.
For sure. Thank you both. Catherine, Anne or Niamh, is there any nugget around Christmas that you had in your minds that you would have liked to have added?
I suppose it depends on whether it's the first Christmas or subsequent Christmas. And I think sometimes you're on adrenaline and you just need to survive the first one and get through it. And I suppose everything stands apart. It's so different from how it was before because it's such a ritualistic time of year. And it's remembering then, you know, what feels right for us right now. And building in a bit of space and time, because sometimes, you know, it might be the children who pull you through the day and you're focused on their energy around Santa, but you also need to just have that little bit of space and time for yourself, you know, whether that's a few minutes in the morning or somewhere over the course of the day. And then look at how do you actually bring that connection with the person into the day sometimes, whether it's an ornament on the Christmas tree, lighting a candle, sometimes very tangible things that can make a big difference to people as a focus for the day as well. So they're just things to think about. And then in second and subsequent years, it can almost feel more raw because you forgot first year because everything was so autopilot and adrenaline and you couldn't take it in. So sometimes in the second year, it's about saying, what do we need to do just for this year and not put yourself under pressure, not even just for that day. But sometimes people think, well, is this how it's always going to be? And again, saying, no, let it evolve. This is what it is this year. We'll see how we are next year and other years. You know, so maybe think in those terms as well to just take some pressure off yourself. And recognizing that family members do it differently too. So sometimes people really want that open display and other times people don't. And just how you might negotiate some of that as well. But like that, maybe sometimes having fun and distraction can be really important.
Yeah. Just to add one bit to what Niamh said is I think it's okay also to make new traditions as the years go on. And that's okay too. And that's maybe a nice thing. You know, it's the way we always used to do it, but maybe there's some new traditions and maybe some of those new traditions could also honor the loved one. And it's okay to be happy and it's okay to be sad because there's often that blend in the day. Yeah.
And I'll just add to it that piece around, you know, we play so many different roles in our life and giving ourselves time around Christmas, you know, to remember that role. So I'm thinking, you know, in the case of my role as a daughter is over in some way, but allowing just a small amount of time to be, you know, to be in that moment of being a daughter. And then allow all the other roles and the fullness of those roles to be there as well. But just to give myself a little bit of space just to remember what it felt like to be a daughter.
That's lovely. Thank you all so much. Time has caught up with us, I'm afraid, as it always does. The world spun, Anne. And I really would just like to thank everybody who participated today. everyone who came and logged into the session, and you all for participating so generously and sharing your personal and your professional experiences. I wanted to thank Dervla and Iris, who kept the whole thing running smoothly, not without a lot of technological know-how and rehearsal. So well done. And Irish Hospice Foundation and Fanagans, the support of Fanagans, we both really wanted to say it's a lovely partnership, and to thank Fanagans for supporting this type of what we would call level 1 support. It's important. I wish you well. As we said, there will be a recording of this session available. When we turn off, Amanda is going to play a song, and it's a song from Sharon Shannon, and it's called Written in the Stars, and Sharon wrote the tune herself, and it's informed by her own grief in general from her life, but very particularly she was explaining it when she started to write it. One of her very precious dogs died, and we were struck by a number of questions that came up in the registration on people whose important relationship that with a pet had left them feeling very isolated. So Sharon wrote the music, and several of her colleagues wrote the words, and it was at a time when one person's brother had died and another person's mother. So it's a lovely song, and together with it, Amanda will give all the details of the services. Sorry, Stephen, did you have your hand up on purpose? Aren't you doing what I do? That's okay. Cheers. So I'll leave it with you to roll that there, Amanda. And thank you everyone once again.
Dear whomever it concerns, there's a lesson everyone must learn. And as tough as it may seem, there's no use swimming against the stream. Though we must journey apart, fate had it planned from the start. Let it be written in the stars, nothing will ever keep us apart. You're still there in the places we would roam, and my heart will forever be your home. And I promise to always hold your hand as long as I can. Do you hear me?
Dear whomever, don't be sad, just be thankful for everything we have. From your spirit in the sky, I'll say so long, but never goodbye. Though we must journey apart, fate had it planned right from the start. Let it be written in the stars, nothing will ever keep us apart.
Oh, I miss you with me? Some say everything must pass.
What a shame, not everything's built to last.
Dear whomever, don't you cry. I'll say so long, but I won't say goodbye.
I say so long, but I won't say goodbye.
I'll say so long, but never goodbye. Dear whomever it concerns, there's a lesson everyone must learn. And as tough as it may seem, there's no use swimming against the stream. Though we must journey apart, fate had it planned from the start. Let it be written in the stars, nothing will ever keep us apart. You're still there in the places we would roam, and my heart will forever be your home. And I promise to always hold your hand as long as I can. Do you hear me?
Dear whomever, don't be sad. Just be thankful for everything we have. From your spirit in the sky, I'll say so long, but never goodbye. Though we must journey apart, fate had it planned right from the start. Let it be written in the stars, nothing will ever keep us apart.
Oh, I miss you and how it makes me sad, and I long for the happiness we have. But if push comes to shove and heaven's above ask me to do it all again, I would if I can take you with me. Some say everything must pass.
What a shame, not everything's built to last.
Dear whomever, don't you cry. I'll say so long, but I won't say goodbye.
I say so long, but I won't say goodbye.
I'll say so long, but never goodbye. Dear whomever it concerns, there's a lesson everyone must learn. And as tough as it may seem, there's no use swimming against a stream. Though we must journey apart, fate had it planned from the start. Let it be written in the stars, nothing will ever keep us apart. You're still there in the places we would roam, and my heart will forever be your home. And I promise to always hold your hand as long as I can. Do you hear me?
Dear whomever, don't be sad. Just be thankful for everything we have. From your spirit in the sky, I'll say so long, but never goodbye. Though we must journey